Desperate billionaire. Breaks down when mysterious maid makes his silent son say mama for the first time. Brian Elmwood froze as his 8-year-old son Samuel ran toward the new maid, tears streaming down his face. For 3 years, Samuel had been completely nonverbal. But as Coco Briscoe knelt down and opened her arms, something impossible happened. "Mama," Samuel whispered, his first word ever spoken aloud. Brian's hands trembled as he recognized the woman he'd searched for across 2 continents, the woman who'd vanished from his life 7 years ago, the only woman he'd ever truly loved. The crystal chandelier above cast fractured light across the marble foyer as Brian's world shifted on its axis. Samuel, who hadn't spoken a single word since his 3rd birthday, was now clinging to a stranger with desperate need. But she wasn't a stranger to Brian. Those gentle brown eyes, that graceful way she moved as she gathered his son into her arms, every detail was seared into his memory from 7 years of searching. "It's okay, sweetheart," Coco whispered to Samuel, her voice the same melodic tone that had haunted Brian's dreams. "You're safe now." Brian's chest tightened as he watched his son, his brilliant, beautiful, silent son, actually make eye contact with another human being for the first time in years. Samuel's small hands gripped Coco's uniform as if she were his lifeline, and Brian felt something crack open inside his ribcage. Anita Bennett, the head housekeeper, cleared her throat disapprovingly from the doorway. "Mr. Elmwood, this is highly irregular. The new girl hasn't even been properly introduced." "Coco!" The name escaped Brian's lips like a prayer, like a curse, like the answer to every sleepless night he'd endured. Their eyes met across the space between them, and time seemed to collapse into that single moment of recognition. Her face went pale beneath her smooth brown skin, her lips parting in shock. "Brian?" she whispered, and the sound of his name in her voice after 7 years of silence nearly brought him to his knees. Samuel looked up at the sound, his wide blue eyes, so much like Brian's own, darting between the 2 adults. For a child who rarely showed interest in people, he seemed to understand the electricity crackling in the air around them. "You know each other?" Anita's voice cut through the tension like a blade, sharp with suspicion and disapproval. Brian's mind raced, struggling to process the impossible. 3 years of hiring the most qualified caregivers, child psychologists, and autism specialists money could buy. 3 years of watching his son retreat further into his silent world while Brian built his tech empire, partly to fund an international search for the woman who disappeared from his life without explanation. And here she was, standing in his foyer in a housekeeping uniform, holding his son like she was born for it. Brian's voice caught, rough with emotion. "We knew each other. Years ago." Coco's arms tightened protectively around Samuel, and Brian noticed how naturally his son melted into her embrace. The ache in his chest deepened as memories flooded back, late nights talking about everything and nothing, her laughter filling his cramped apartment before he'd built his fortune, the way she'd traced patterns on his chest while they planned a future together. A future that had ended one morning when he'd woken to find her gone, leaving only a note that said she was sorry and couldn't stay. "Samuel," Brian said gently, stepping closer. His son's eyes focused on him with more attention than he'd shown in months. "This is Coco. She's going to be helping around the house." The word helping felt like ashes in his mouth. This woman had a master's degree in child psychology. He knew because he'd memorized every detail of her life he could uncover during his search. She was brilliant, compassionate, and deserved so much more than cleaning houses for people who couldn't see her worth. People like Anita, who was watching the interaction with narrowed eyes. "Well," Anita sniffed, "I suppose if Mr. Samuel has taken to her, we should proceed with the orientation, though I must say, this level of familiarity is quite unusual for a first meeting." Coco slowly stood, keeping one hand on Samuel's shoulder. The boy immediately reached for her other hand, a gesture of connection that made Brian's throat close up entirely. Samuel never touched anyone voluntarily. Never. "I have experience with children who have special needs," Coco said carefully, her professional mask sliding into place. But Brian caught the slight tremor in her voice, the way she avoided looking directly at him. Sometimes there's an instant connection that can't be explained. She was right about that. The connection between them had been instant too, all those years ago when they'd met at a community center where she was volunteering and he was fixing computers for free. One look across that crowded room, and his entire world had rewritten itself around the possibility of loving her. "Indeed," Anita said dryly. "Well, Coco Briscoe, let me show you to your quarters and explain your duties. Mr. Samuel's schedule is quite rigid, and there are rules about interaction with the family." "Actually," Brian interrupted, his voice stronger now, "I'd like to speak with Miss Briscoe first." About Samuel's needs. The lie came easily, but it wasn't entirely untrue. Samuel did have needs, and somehow this woman was already meeting them in ways Brian had thought impossible. But more than that, he needed answers. 7 years of questions that had eaten away at him like acid, 7 years of wondering what he'd done wrong to make her leave. "Certainly, Mr. Elmwood," Coco replied, and the formal distance in her tone cut him deeper than any blade could have. "I'm here to serve your family's needs." Your family's needs. As if she wasn't part of that equation, as if she hadn't once been the center of every dream he'd ever had about what family could mean. Samuel tugged on Coco's hand, his eyes bright with an awareness Brian hadn't seen in far too long. Without words, his son was communicating something profound, that this woman understood him in ways others couldn't, that she represented safety in a world that had often felt frightening and overwhelming. Have you ever had someone from your past suddenly reappear when you least expected it? Tell me about that moment in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from, and hit subscribe if this reunion is already pulling at your heartstrings. "Why don't we go to my office?" Brian suggested, his pulse hammering against his collar. "Samuel can come too if he'd like." Anita's mouth pinched with disapproval, but she couldn't argue with Samuel's obvious comfort in Coco's presence. "Very well. But I'll expect a full briefing on household protocols afterward." As they walked through the mansion's halls, Brian was hyper-aware of every detail, the way Coco's hand felt perfectly natural in Samuel's smaller one, how his son actually looked around with interest instead of staring at the floor, the familiar grace in her movements that had haunted his memory for years. His office was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, filled with the awards and accolades that marked his rise from working-class kid to billionaire entrepreneur. But none of it mattered now, not with Coco standing in the space where he'd spent countless hours wondering where she'd gone. Samuel immediately gravitated toward the art supplies Brian kept in one corner, materials every specialist had recommended, though his son had never shown interest before. Now, with Coco's encouraging smile, Samuel picked up a crayon like it held the secrets of the universe. "He's beautiful," Coco said softly, watching Samuel with professional assessment mixed with genuine warmth. "His eyes are just like yours." The observation hit Brian like a physical blow. Those were the same words she'd whispered to him 7 years ago, when they'd lain in bed making plans about the children they'd have someday. Children with his eyes and her smile, children they'd raised together in a house full of laughter and love. "He was diagnosed 3 years ago," Brian said, his voice carefully controlled. "High-functioning autism spectrum disorder. He stopped speaking entirely after his mother left." Coco's head snapped toward him, something painful flashing across her features. His mother left? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Brian wasn't ready to explore. Not yet. Not until he understood why she'd left him, why she'd vanished without a trace when they'd been planning a future together. "It's complicated," he said finally. Samuel had settled on the floor with paper and crayons, his small hands moving with surprising coordination as he began to draw. Coco watched him with the trained eye of someone who understood child development, and Brian found himself studying her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the way her lips curved when she smiled at his son. She was even more beautiful than his memory had painted her, but there was something different now. A sadness around her eyes, a careful distance that hadn't been there before. Life had marked her just as it had marked him, carving experience into the lines of her face and the set of her shoulders. "He's very intelligent," she observed, kneeling beside Samuel. "Look at the way he's organizing his colors, the deliberate patterns in his drawing, This level of focus is remarkable. Brian crouched down beside them, close enough to catch the familiar scent of her perfume, something light and floral that had clung to his pillows long after she'd gone. The proximity made his chest ache with longing and confusion in equal measure. The specialists say he processes the world differently, Brian explained, watching his son work. Social interaction is challenging for him, but he sees patterns others miss. Different doesn't mean less, Coco said firmly. It just means he needs people who understand his language. The words resonated in Brian's chest, partly because they revealed her professional knowledge, and partly because they reminded him of why he'd fallen for her in the first place. She saw worth where others saw problems, potential where others saw limitations, just like she'd once seen potential in a broke computer repair technician with big dreams and calloused hands. Samuel looked up from his drawing, his gaze moving between Brian and Coco with that unsettling perception autistic children often possessed. Without warning, he reached for both their hands, placing Brian's palm against Coco's. The contact was electric. 7 years dissolved into nothing as skin touched skin, as muscle memory awakened feelings Brian had tried to bury beneath work and responsibility and the crushing weight of single parenthood. Coco's breath hitched, her eyes widening as the same recognition flooded her features. "Samuel," she whispered, but she didn't pull away. Neither did Brian. For a moment they were frozen in time, two people who'd loved and lost and found each other again in the most impossible circumstances, connected by the innocent trust of a child who somehow understood they belonged together. Then Anita's voice echoed from the hallway, sharp and disapproving, shattering the spell. "Mr. Elmwood, I do hope you're conducting a proper interview in there." Coco jerked her hand back as if burned, the professional mask slamming back into place. But Brian had felt her pulse racing under his touch, had seen the recognition and longing in her eyes before she'd hidden it away. "We should discuss Samuel's routine," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion Brian could read in every line of her body. "Yes," he agreed, though what he really wanted was to demand answers, to understand why she'd left, to know if she'd missed him even half as much as he'd missed her. His routine is very important. But as they talked about schedules and therapies and the careful structure that helped Samuel navigate his world, Brian's mind was spinning with questions that had nothing to do with his son's care and everything to do with the woman who'd just turned his carefully ordered life upside down. Again. Samuel finished his drawing and held it up proudly, 3 stick figures holding hands, standing in front of a house with smoke curling from the chimney. A family. The image hit Brian like a punch to the solar plexus, especially when Samuel pointed to each figure in turn. Daddy. Mama. Me. The word mama fell from his son's lips like it belonged there, like he'd been saving it for exactly this moment, exactly this person. Tears pricked Brian's eyes as he realized Samuel had been waiting for someone who would understand his silent world well enough to coax him back into speaking. Someone like Coco. Coco's own eyes were bright with unshed tears as she looked at the drawing, at Samuel's hopeful face, at Brian's obvious emotional struggle. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she told Samuel. "The most beautiful family I've ever seen." Family. The word hung in the air between them, impossible and inevitable, terrifying and wonderful all at once. Because despite everything, despite 7 years of separation, despite the professional boundaries that should exist between them, despite all the reasons this could never work, Samuel had seen something in that first moment that the adults were too scared to acknowledge. He'd seen them as they were meant to be. Together. Chapter 2. The next morning arrived with the kind of awkward tension that made breathing feel like a conscious effort. Brian stood at his bedroom window, watching Coco in the garden below as she helped Samuel feed the koi fish in the ornamental pond. His son's laughter, actual audible laughter, drifted up through the morning air, a sound Brian had thought he might never hear again. 3 caregivers with advanced degrees in child psychology had tried and failed to reach Samuel. One woman who disappeared from Brian's life 7 years ago had managed it in less than 24 hours. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Sir?" Robert Martinez, his assistant and closest friend, appeared in the doorway with a tablet full of appointments and an expression of barely contained curiosity. "Your 9 o'clock is here. The Henderson acquisition meeting?" Brian nodded without turning from the window. Below, Coco was showing Samuel how to count the fish, her patient voice carrying up through the glass. Samuel was actually participating, pointing and attempting to form words Brian couldn't quite hear from this distance. "Sir?" Robert stepped closer. "Is everything all right? You seem distracted." That was putting it mildly. Brian had spent the night staring at the ceiling, his mind churning with memories and questions and the impossible reality that Coco Briscoe, the woman he'd loved with the devastating intensity only possible at 25, was sleeping 3 floors below him in the staff quarters. "The new housekeeper," Brian said finally. "What do you know about her background?" Robert consulted his tablet. "Coco Briscoe, 29 years old, master's degree in child psychology from Northwestern University, summa cum laude. Previous employment includes a pediatric therapy center in Chicago and private childcare for several families. References are impeccable, though there's a gap in her resume from about 6 to 7 years ago." Of course there was. That gap represented the time she'd spent with him, the months when they'd been inseparable, when she'd been working toward her degree while he'd been building his first company from nothing. The time before, she'd vanished like morning mist, leaving him to wonder if he'd imagined the depth of their connection. "Her qualifications seem excessive for housekeeping," Brian observed. "Perhaps. But her student loan debt is substantial, and she's also supporting an elderly grandmother in a care facility. Sometimes people take whatever work pays the bills." Robert paused. Should I be concerned about something? Before Brian could answer, a commotion erupted from the garden below. Samuel was having what looked like a meltdown, not unusual, but heartbreaking every time. Brian was halfway to the door when he saw Coco's response. Instead of trying to restrain Samuel or flood him with words like most people did, she simply sat down beside him on the stone bench. She didn't touch him, didn't speak. She just sat there, a calm presence in his storm, humming something too quiet for Brian to hear. Gradually, incredibly, Samuel's distress began to ease. His frantic movements slowed, his breathing evened out. After several minutes, he leaned against Coco's shoulder, and she wrapped one gentle arm around him. "Remarkable," Robert murmured, having joined Brian at the window. "I've never seen anyone manage his episodes that effectively." Brian's throat felt tight. "She has a gift." "Indeed. Though I have to ask, do you know her? Because Anita mentioned some familiarity between you yesterday, and you don't usually take personal interest in hiring household staff." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Brian could deflect, could maintain the professional distance that would be safer for everyone involved. But watching Coco comfort his son with the same gentle strength she'd once used to comfort him, he found himself unwilling to reduce their history to nothing. "We were involved. Years ago." Robert's eyebrows rose. "Involved how?" "We lived together for 8 months. I was planning to propose. The admission came out rougher than Brian intended. She left without explanation. And now she's working as your housekeeper." "Apparently?" Robert was quiet for a long moment, watching the scene in the garden with new understanding. "That's complicated. That's one word for it." Below, Coco was helping Samuel to his feet, brushing dirt from his clothes with the same careful attention a mother might show. Samuel's arms went around her waist in a spontaneous hug that made Brian's chest ache with longing and loss. "Sir," Robert said carefully, "if you have history with this woman, having her in your home might not be wise, especially given Samuel's obvious attachment." Brian knew his friend was right. The smart thing would be to transfer Coco to another position, perhaps help her find work that better matched her qualifications. Remove the temptation and the complication before anyone got hurt. But watching his son interact with natural ease for the first time in years, seeing the first genuine progress Samuel had made since his diagnosis, how could Brian take that away from him? "We'll manage," Brian said finally. Robert's expression suggested he doubted that very much, but he simply nodded. "The Henderson meeting? Give me 10 minutes. After Robert left, Brian remained at the window, memorizing the sight of Coco and Samuel together. Whatever had happened between them 7 years ago, whatever had driven her away, she was helping his son in ways no one else could. For now, that had to be enough, even if it was slowly killing him. Later that afternoon, Brian found himself inventing excuses to walk past wherever Coco was working. It was pathetic behavior, and he knew it, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. 7 years of wondering where she was, and now she was here, close enough to touch but separated by an ocean of unspoken history. He found her in the library, showing Samuel picture books about ocean animals. His son was actually looking at the pages, pointing at the colorful illustrations with genuine interest. The sight stopped Brian in his tracks. "He likes marine life," Coco explained without looking up, somehow aware of his presence in that uncanny way she'd always had. The patterns in the coral, the repetitive movements of the fish, they're soothing for him. "I never knew that," Brian admitted, stepping closer. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows turned her skin golden, highlighted the graceful line of her neck as she bent over the book. "He's never shown interest in books before. Every child has interests. Sometimes it just takes patience to discover them." She turned a page to reveal a spread of tropical fish. "Look, Samuel. See how they all swim together? That's called a school." "School," Samuel repeated, his pronunciation careful but clear. Brian's breath caught. 2 words in 2 days, after 3 years of silence. It felt like witnessing a miracle. "That's right, sweetheart," Coco praised, her voice warm with genuine delight. "You're so smart." Samuel beamed at the praise, then looked at Brian expectantly, as if waiting for him to acknowledge this momentous achievement. The trust in his son's eyes was overwhelming. "You are smart," Brian agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "So very smart." For a moment, the three of them existed in perfect harmony, a family sharing a simple, precious moment. But then reality crashed back in, reminding Brian that this wasn't his family, that Coco was here as an employee, that he had no right to the feelings swelling in his chest. "I should check his therapy schedule," Coco said quietly, closing the book. Dr. Chen wanted daily reports on his verbal progress. The mention of Samuel's therapist broke the spell entirely. Brian straightened, forcing himself back into employer mode. "Of course. His speech therapy is Tuesdays and Thursdays at 2. I'll coordinate with his sessions." She stood, smoothing her uniform with hands that trembled slightly. "If you'll excuse me, I should help prepare dinner." She was dismissing him from his own library. The professional distance in her tone stung more than it should have, especially when he could see the pulse fluttering in her throat, the way her fingers worried the hem of her uniform. Coco. Her name escaped him before he could stop it. She paused but didn't turn around. "Yes, Mr. Elmwood?" The formal address felt like a slap. "We need to talk. About Samuel's care, his progress. Of course, I can prepare a detailed report for your review." "That's not what I meant." Samuel looked between them with that perceptive awareness that often made Brian feel like his 8-year-old son understood the adult world better than the adults themselves. The boy's expression was troubled, as if he could sense the tension crackling between the two people he'd decided belonged together. "I think we should focus on Samuel's needs right now," Coco said carefully. "Everything else is complicated." She was right, and Brian hated it. Everything about this situation was complicated. Their history, their current roles, the way Samuel had bonded to her with startling intensity, the way Brian's own feelings were resurging with devastating clarity. But complicated didn't make it less real. "Fine," Brian agreed, though nothing about this felt fine. "We'll focus on Samuel." Coco nodded and led Samuel toward the door, but just before they left, his son surprised them both by turning back. "Daddy sad?" Samuel asked, his young voice filled with concern. The question hit Brian like a physical blow. Samuel rarely asked questions, rarely showed interest in other people's emotions. The fact that he'd noticed Brian's distress and cared enough to ask about it was another breakthrough. "No, buddy," Brian managed. "Daddy's just thinking." Samuel considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. Then he walked back to Brian and wrapped his small arms around his father's waist in a rare display of affection. "Love, Daddy," Samuel whispered against his chest. Brian's eyes filled with tears he couldn't suppress. "I love you too, Samuel. So much." When his son pulled back, he looked directly into Brian's eyes, another rarity, and said with perfect clarity, "Love Mama too." The words hung in the air like a grenade pin that had been pulled. Samuel's innocent declaration that he loved Mama, his name for Coco, created a silence so profound Brian could hear his own heartbeat. Coco's face went pale, her eyes wide with something that looked like panic. "Samuel, sweetheart, I'm not—" "Mama," Samuel insisted, reaching for her hand. "Love Mama." The simple, trusting declaration from his son shattered every careful boundary Brian had been trying to maintain. Because Samuel was right, in the way children often were, about things adults made too complicated. He did love Coco, had never stopped loving her, despite 7 years of trying to convince himself otherwise. And now, his son loved her too. "We should go," Coco whispered, her professional composure cracking. "Samuel needs his dinner routine." She practically fled the library, Samuel's hand in hers, leaving Brian alone with the echo of words that changed everything. Love Mama too. As if it were that simple. As if love could bridge 7 years of silence, professional boundaries, and all the reasons this could never work. As if a child's innocent heart could see what the adults were too frightened to acknowledge, that some connections transcended logic, job titles, and even time itself. Brian sank into one of the leather chairs, his head in his hands, wondering how he was supposed to protect his heart and his son's happiness, when the woman who could destroy them both was the same woman who was finally helping Samuel heal. The same woman he'd never stopped loving, no matter how hard he'd tried. Chapter 3. 3 days later, Brian's carefully constructed world of professional boundaries shattered completely during what should have been a routine discussion about Samuel's therapy. "Absolutely not," Brian said firmly, his voice echoing in the hallway outside Samuel's playroom. "I won't have my son treated like a test subject for some experimental approach." Coco stood her ground, her chin lifted in the stubborn way he remembered from their arguments years ago, though those had usually ended in laughter and kisses, not this sharp-edged tension that made the air between them feel combustible. "It's not experimental," she replied, her professional calm barely masking the fire in her eyes. "Art therapy combined with music stimulation has shown remarkable results in children with autism spectrum disorders. Samuel responded beautifully to it yesterday." "You mean when he had that meltdown afterward? When he couldn't sleep for 3 hours because he was overstimulated?" "That's a normal response to breakthrough moments. His brain was processing new neural pathways." "Don't." Brian stepped closer, his voice dropping to the dangerous quiet that made board members nervous. "Don't use clinical language to dismiss my son's distress. I know Samuel better than anyone. Do you?" The question escaped Coco before she could stop it, and Brian saw the moment she realized she'd crossed a line, but instead of backing down, she pressed forward. "Because from what I've observed, Samuel has been trying to communicate in ways you haven't recognized. The meltdown wasn't random. He was frustrated because he had something to express and couldn't find the words." "And you figured this out in 3 days? When teams of specialists have been working with him for 3 years? The accusation hung between them like a blade. Brian immediately regretted it. Coco's connection with Samuel was genuine, not some professional calculation, but his frustration and fear were making him lash out at the one person who was actually helping his son. "Maybe," Coco said quietly. "They've been trying to fix what they see as broken instead of understanding what makes him whole." The words hit Brian like a physical blow because they were absolutely true. Every specialist, every therapy session, every intervention had been focused on making Samuel more normal, more like neurotypical children his age. Coco was the first person to suggest that Samuel didn't need fixing. He needed understanding. "I'm sorry," Brian said roughly, running a hand through his hair. "That was unfair. I know you care about him." "I do care about him." Her voice was soft now, vulnerable in a way that made Brian's chest ache. More than I probably should, given my position here. They were standing close now, close enough that Brian could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, could catch the familiar scent of her perfume. The professional distance they'd been maintaining felt as fragile as spun glass. Your position, Brian repeated, the words tasting bitter. Is that what we're calling this? It's what it is. But her voice lacked conviction, and her eyes were fixed on his mouth in a way that made Brian's pulse hammer against his collar. Is it? He took another step closer, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had captured him 7 years ago. Because it doesn't feel professional when Samuel calls you Mama. When he draws pictures of us as a family. When I can't think about anything except what? The question was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 7 years of separation, of questions unasked and truths unspoken. Except how much I've missed you, Brian admitted, his voice raw with honesty. How many nights I've wondered where you were, if you were safe, if you ever thought about us. A door slammed somewhere in the mansion, the sound breaking through their charged atmosphere like cold water. They sprang apart, both breathing hard, both acutely aware of how close they'd come to crossing a line they couldn't uncross. We can't do this, Coco whispered, but her hands were shaking as she pressed them against her uniform, trying to smooth wrinkles that weren't there. Can't do what? Talk about the past, acknowledge that there's still something between us? We can't complicate Samuel's progress with our history. She straightened her shoulders, trying to rebuild the professional wall between them. He's making incredible strides, and I won't jeopardize that because we can't maintain appropriate boundaries. She was right, and Brian hated it. Samuel's well-being had to come first, no matter what it cost them personally. You're right, he said finally. Samuel comes first. Coco nodded, relief and disappointment warring in her expression. Samuel comes first. But as she turned to walk away, Brian caught her wrist gently, the contact sending electricity shooting up his arm. She gasped at the touch, her eyes flying to his, and for a moment neither of them moved. Coco, he said quietly, just tell me one thing. Did you ever think about us? About what we had? Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Every day, she whispered. I thought about us every single day. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was brave enough to cross. Then, Coco gently pulled her wrist free and walked away, leaving Brian alone in the hallway with the echo of her words and the lingering warmth where their skin had touched. That evening, Brian found himself pacing his study like a caged animal. Every attempt to focus on work failed, his mind returning obsessively to that moment in the hallway when Coco had been close enough to kiss, when the truth had slipped out, despite all their careful boundaries. I thought about us every single day. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Come in. Samuel appeared in the doorway, already in his pajamas, clutching the stuffed dolphin Coco had bought him after discovering his fascination with marine life. Daddy? Samuel's voice was tentative but clear. The progress in his speech over just a few days was remarkable. What is it, buddy? Samuel approached with the serious expression he wore when trying to communicate something important. Mama sad. Brian's heart clenched. What do you mean? Mama crying. In kitchen. Samuel's brow furrowed with concern. Help Mama. The image of Coco crying alone in the kitchen while she prepared their dinner hit Brian like a sledgehammer. He'd been so focused on maintaining professional distance that he hadn't considered how difficult the situation might be for her too. Did you try to help her? Brian asked gently. Samuel nodded solemnly. Hugged Mama. But still sad. Of course he had. Despite his autism, or perhaps because of it, Samuel possessed an emotional intelligence that often surpassed adults. He could sense distress in ways others missed, could offer comfort with startling intuition. You're a good boy, Samuel. A very good boy. Love Mama, Samuel said simply, as if this explained everything, and maybe it did. I know you do. Daddy loved Mama too. The question, asked with a child's directness, caught Brian completely off guard. There was no hiding from Samuel's perceptive gaze, no deflecting with adult complications and professional boundaries. "Yes," Brian said quietly. "Daddy loves Mama too." Samuel smiled, a radiant expression that transformed his entire face. "Good. Family loves family. Family loves family." Such a simple concept, delivered with the wisdom only children possessed, no mention of job titles or social expectations or the complicated history between adults. Just the pure truth that families love each other and that love was reason enough for everything else. "Can I tell you a secret, buddy?" Brian asked, kneeling to Samuel's eye level. Samuel nodded eagerly. "Sometimes grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be. But you're right, families love each other, and maybe that's all that really matters." Samuel considered this with the gravity of a philosophy professor. "Tell Mama? Tell Mama what?" "That Daddy loves Mama, that we are family." Samuel's expression grew earnest. "Make Mama happy." The innocent solution, "just tell her," struck Brian as both impossibly simple and terrifyingly complex. But looking into his son's trusting eyes, seeing the hope there, Brian found himself nodding. "You're very smart, Samuel. Smarter than your daddy sometimes." Samuel giggled, an actual giggle, and threw his arms around Brian's neck. "Love you, Daddy." "I love you too, more than all the fish in the ocean." After tucking Samuel into bed, Brian found himself walking toward the kitchen despite every logical reason to stay away. He told himself he was just checking to make sure everything was secure for the night, but his heart hammered with nervous energy that had nothing to do with household security. The kitchen was dimly lit, just the under-cabinet lighting casting a warm glow over the granite counters. Coco stood at the island, her back to the doorway, shoulders rigid with tension as she mechanically wiped down surfaces that were already spotless. Coco. Her name escaped him before he could reconsider. She stiffened but didn't turn around. "Mr. Elmwood, I was just finishing the evening cleanup. Samuel came to see me. He said you were upset." Her movement stilled completely. "I'm fine. Just tired." "Are you?" Brian stepped into the kitchen, closing the distance between them despite every voice in his head screaming that this was dangerous territory. "Because Samuel seemed to think you were crying." Samuel misunderstood, but her voice was thick with emotion, betraying the lie. Brian moved around the island so he could see her face, and his heart clenched at the evidence of tears she'd tried to hide. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her usual composure fractured in a way that made him want to gather her in his arms and promise that everything would be okay. "Talk to me," he said gently. "Please." We agreed to maintain professional boundaries. She turned back to her cleaning, attacking the pristine counter with renewed vigor. "This conversation isn't appropriate." "Screw appropriate." The words came out sharper than he intended, born of frustration and 7 years of unanswered questions. "You're crying in my kitchen at 10 o'clock at night. Samuel's worried about you. I'm worried about you. So tell me what's wrong." Coco's hands stilled on the cloth, her knuckles white with tension. "What's wrong is that I made a mistake coming here. What's wrong is that I'm getting too attached to a little boy who isn't mine, falling back into patterns with a man who can never be more than my employer. What's wrong is that I know better than this, and I'm doing it anyway." The raw honesty in her voice hit Brian like a physical blow. She was feeling everything he was feeling, the impossible pull between them, the way Samuel had wrapped himself around both their hearts, the cruel irony that she'd become essential to their lives in the worst possible circumstances. "He could be yours," Brian said quietly. "Samuel. He already thinks of you as his mother." Coco's shoulders shook with suppressed emotion. "Don't say that." "Why not?" "It's true. He's never bonded with anyone the way he's bonded with you, never shown this much progress, never seemed this happy. Because I'm the help." The words exploded out of her, years of frustration and pain finally finding voice. "I'm the woman you pay to clean your house and watch your son. Whatever we had 7 years ago, whatever feelings might still exist between us, none of that changes the reality of what I am to you now." Brian stared at her, stunned by the hurt and self-recrimination in her voice. Is that really what you think? That I see you as the help? What else am I supposed to think? She finally turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. You have a mansion in the hills, a billion-dollar company, social connections I couldn't even imagine, and I'm scrubbing your floors and doing your laundry because I have student loans that will take me 20 years to pay off, and a grandmother whose medical bills eat every penny I make. Those are circumstances, Coco. Not who you are. Aren't they? She laughed bitterly. Look around, Brian. This kitchen is bigger than the apartment we shared when we were together. Your son's playroom costs more than I make in a year. The distance between who we are now, it's not something love can bridge. You're wrong. Brian stepped closer, his voice fierce with conviction. You think money changed who I am? You think success made me forget where I came from, forget what matters? Didn't it? No. He reached for her hands, holding them despite her instinct to pull away. You want to know what changed me? Losing you. Waking up one morning to find you gone without explanation, spending 7 years wondering what I did wrong, what I could have done differently, building an empire, partly because I hoped it would help me find you again. Coco stared at him, her breath coming in short gasps. Brian, you want to know what my success means to me? Nothing. It means nothing if I can't share it with the people I love, and I've never stopped loving you, Coco. Not for a single day in 7 years. The confession hung between them like a live wire, dangerous and electric and impossible to ignore. Coco's eyes searched his face, looking for lies or manipulation, finding only the raw truth he'd been trying to hide since the moment she'd walked back into his life. Why? She whispered. Why didn't you look harder? Why didn't you find me? I tried. His voice cracked with the memory of those desperate months. I hired investigators, called every hospital and shelter within 500 miles, contacted everyone we knew, but you'd disappeared completely, like you'd never existed. Tears fell freely down her cheeks now. I had to disappear. I had to make sure you couldn't find me. Why? The question that had tormented him for 7 years finally found voice. What did I do that was so terrible you had to run away in the middle of the night? Coco closed her eyes, her whole body trembling with the weight of secrets she'd carried alone. When she opened them again, Brian saw a pain so deep it took his breath away. You didn't do anything terrible, she whispered. I did. Before Brian could ask what she meant, before he could demand the explanation he'd waited 7 years to hear, the kitchen door swung open and Anita appeared, her disapproving gaze taking in their proximity, their obvious emotional state, their clasped hands. I beg your pardon, Anita said coldly, but I came to ensure the kitchen was properly secured for the evening. Brian and Coco sprang apart as if burned, the moment of connection shattered by reality intruding in the form of a disapproving housekeeper who represented everything standing between them. Of course, Coco said quickly, wiping her cheeks and trying to reassemble her professional mask. I was just finishing up. Indeed. Anita's tone suggested she'd witnessed far more than kitchen cleanup. I trust everything is appropriate? The question carried layers of meaning, all of them threatening. Brian felt Coco withdraw into herself, the vulnerability she'd shown moments earlier disappearing behind walls of professional distance and social awareness. Everything is fine, Anita, Brian said firmly. Miss Briscoe was updating me on Samuel's progress. At 10:30 in the evening, in the kitchen, while she's crying. Anita's tone made clear exactly what she thought of that explanation. Samuel's care is important to me, Brian replied, his voice carrying the authority that had built his empire. I'll discuss it with his caregivers whenever necessary. Anita inclined her head with barely concealed disapproval. Of course, sir. I'll leave you to your discussion. She swept from the kitchen with the dignity of someone who'd just won a battle, leaving Brian and Coco alone with the wreckage of a moment that had promised answers and delivered only more complications. I should go, Coco said quietly, not meeting his eyes. Coco, wait. Please. She looked up at him, and Brian saw the fear there, the awareness of how close they'd come to crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. "We can't do this. Not here. Not like this. Samuel needs stability, and I need this job. We have to be more careful." She was right, and Brian hated it. But as she walked toward the door, he couldn't let her leave without acknowledging what had passed between them. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Coco paused in the doorway, her hand on the frame. "It has to be." "No," Brian said firmly. "It doesn't. Whatever happened 7 years ago, whatever you think you did that was so terrible, we'll figure it out. But I won't lose you again, Coco. I can't." She didn't respond, but Brian saw her shoulders shake with emotion before she disappeared into the darkened hallway. He remained in the kitchen long after her footsteps faded, staring at the space where she'd stood, replaying every word and gesture, and the devastating moment when truth had flickered between them like lightning. "I had to disappear. I had to make sure you couldn't find me. You didn't do anything terrible." "I did." What secret was so devastating that she disappeared from his life rather than face it? What had driven the woman he'd planned to marry to run away in the middle of the night, leaving only questions and heartbreak in her wake? And how was he supposed to concentrate on anything else when the answers to 7 years of torment were sleeping 3 floors below him, wearing a housekeeper's uniform, and breaking his heart all over again? Chapter 4. The breakthrough came 3 days later, in the garden where everything had begun to unravel 7 years ago. Brian stood at his office window, pretending to review quarterly reports while actually watching Coco work with Samuel among the rose bushes. His son was attempting to identify different flower colors, a simple exercise that represented monumental progress for a child who'd barely acknowledged his surroundings just a week ago. "Red," Samuel said carefully, pointing to a bloom. "Very good. And this one?" "Yellow." Samuel's voice carried excitement now, genuine engagement that made Brian's chest tight with gratitude and something deeper, more dangerous. "And this one?" Coco held up a pink rose, her smile radiant as she watched Samuel think. Samuel studied the flower with the intense focus he brought to everything interesting. "Pink, like Mama's dress." The casual observation hit Brian like a sledgehammer. Samuel was making connections, relating new information to his personal world. But more than that, he was claiming Coco as family with the innocent certainty only children possessed. Brian's phone buzzed with messages from his assistant, appointment reminders, stock reports, all the urgent matters that usually consumed his attention. Today, none of it seemed to matter compared to the scene unfolding in his garden. "Mr. Elmwood," Robert appeared in the doorway with his usual expression of barely contained concern. "The board meeting is in 20 minutes. Cancel it." "Sir? Cancel the board meeting. Reschedule everything this afternoon." Robert's eyebrows rose. "Everything? Including the Henderson acquisition review?" "Everything." Brian closed his laptop with finality. "There's something more important happening in my garden." His assistant followed Brian's gaze to the window, where Coco was now sitting cross-legged on the grass, while Samuel arranged flowers in patterns around her. The picture they made, woman and child absorbed in simple discovery, was almost painfully beautiful. "More important than a $50 million acquisition?" Robert asked carefully. "Yes." Brian grabbed his suit jacket, already moving toward the door. Much more important. He found them by the fountain, Samuel's small hands dirty with soil as he proudly displayed a bouquet of roses he'd picked himself. Coco's uniform was grass-stained, her hair escaping its neat bun, and Brian thought she'd never looked more beautiful. "Daddy," Samuel called, his face lighting up. "Look! Flowers for Mama." The simple statement lodged itself in Brian's throat. Flowers for Mama, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if Coco belonged in this garden, in this family, in their lives permanently. "They're beautiful, buddy," Brian managed, his voice rougher than intended. "Mama helped," Samuel explained seriously, "but I picked them myself." "You did an excellent job." Brian knelt beside his son, close enough to catch the familiar scent of Coco's perfume mixed with sunshine and earth. "These are the prettiest flowers I've ever seen." Samuel beamed at the praise, then carefully arranged his bouquet in Coco's lap. For you, Mama. Because you're pretty like flowers. Coco's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. Thank you, sweetheart. They're the most wonderful flowers anyone has ever given me. Really? Really? Samuel's smile could have powered the entire mansion. Without warning, he threw his arms around Coco's neck in one of his rare displays of physical affection. Love you, Mama. I love you too, Samuel, she whispered, her voice breaking. So very much. Brian watched the exchange with his heart hammering against his ribs. This was what he'd dreamed of during all those lonely years. A family, love freely given and received, his son happy and thriving. The fact that it was happening with Coco, the woman he'd never stopped loving, felt like destiny and disaster rolled into one impossible moment. Should we put these in water? Coco suggested, gathering Samuel's bouquet. So they'll last longer? Yes, Samuel scrambled to his feet. In my room, so I can see them every day. As they walked toward the house, Samuel between them chattering about flower names and colors, Brian felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Complete contentment. This felt right in ways he couldn't analyze or explain. Natural as breathing, inevitable as sunrise. It wasn't until Samuel ran ahead to wash his hands that Brian realized he and Coco were alone in the garden, surrounded by the roses that had witnessed their first meeting, their first kiss, their first whispered promises of forever. He's so happy, Coco said softly, watching Samuel disappear through the French doors. I've never seen a child bloom like this. Neither have I. Brian turned to face her, noting how the afternoon light turned her skin golden, how grass stains somehow made her more beautiful instead of less. You've given him something no one else could. He's given me something too. Her voice was thick with emotion, purpose, joy, a reason to believe in miracles. They stood facing each other among the roses, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. Brian could see the pulse fluttering in Coco's throat, could hear the slight catch in her breathing that meant she was fighting the same magnetic pull that had captured him. Coco, he said quietly, about the other night. We can't keep doing this. But her voice lacked conviction, and her eyes were fixed on his mouth in a way that made his pulse hammer. We agreed to maintain professional boundaries. I know what we agreed. Brian stepped closer, drawn by forces beyond logic or professional propriety. But what we agreed and what's actually happening are two different things. Brian. His name escaped her lips like a prayer, like a warning. Tell me you don't feel it, he challenged softly. Tell me you don't feel this pull between us, this sense that some things are meant to be. Feeling something and acting on it are different things. Are they? He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek with gentle fingers. She leaned into the caress before she could stop herself, and Brian's breath caught at the simple, devastating gesture. Because it feels like you're fighting something that doesn't want to be fought. I have to fight it. Tears spilled over, tracking down her cheeks. For Samuel's sake, for your reputation, for my job. What about for your happiness? Brian's thumb traced the path of her tears, and Coco's eyes fluttered closed at the touch. What about for love? Love isn't always enough. Isn't it? He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Because Samuel seems to think it is. Family loves family, he told me. Simple as that. From the mouth of babes, she whispered, but her hands were trembling as she pressed them against his chest. The wisest words I've heard in years. Brian covered her hands with his own, holding them against his heart. I love you, Coco. I've loved you for 7 years, through your absence, through the questions, through building an empire, partly just to have the resources to find you again. And Samuel loves you. And you love us. Isn't that enough to at least try? Her eyes opened, searching his face for lies or false promises, finding only truth and hope and the same desperate longing that was eating him alive. I'm scared, she admitted. So am I. He traced the line of her jaw with reverent fingers. Terrified. But I'm more scared of losing you again, of wasting this second chance we've been given. What if I hurt Samuel? What if this doesn't work and he gets caught in the middle? What if it does work, Brian countered. What if this is exactly what all of us need to heal? For a moment, Coco wavered on the edge of decision. Brian could see the war between hope and fear in her expression, the way she wanted to believe but couldn't quite trust that something this good could be real. Then, Samuel's voice drifted from the house. Laughter, pure and joyful, the sound of a child who felt safe and loved and whole. He's never laughed like that before, Brian said quietly. Not until you came back into our lives. He's an incredible little boy. He is. And he deserves a complete family. We all do. The truth of it hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Brian could see the moment Coco's walls began to crumble, the instant when love finally overcame fear. Brian, she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like coming home. Yes? I never stopped loving you either. The admission broke something open in Brian's chest, 7 years of grief and longing transforming into fierce, overwhelming joy. Without thinking, without calculating consequences or professional boundaries, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. The contact was electric. 7 years dissolved into nothing as muscle memory awakened, as their bodies remembered what their minds had tried to forget. Coco melted into him with a soft sound of surrender, her arms sliding around his neck, her fingers tangling in his hair. The kiss deepened, desperate with years of separation and longing. Brian's hands slid down to her waist, pulling her closer, needing to convince himself that this was real, that she was here, that after 7 years of searching, he'd finally found his way home. I missed you, he murmured against her lips. God, how I missed you. I'm sorry, she whispered back, tears and kisses mingling. I'm so sorry I left. I'm sorry I stayed away. I'm sorry. Shh. He silenced her with gentle kisses, forgiving everything in the space between heartbeats. You're here now. That's all that matters. They held each other in the garden where their love had first bloomed, surrounded by roses and afternoon sunlight and the sound of Samuel's laughter from inside the house. For the first time in 7 years, Brian felt complete. What happens now? Coco asked against his shoulder, her voice muffled by emotion and the soft fabric of his shirt. Now we figure it out together. Brian pulled back enough to see her face, to memorize the hope dawning in her eyes. All of us, as a family. The complications, we'll handle them, together. Anita will disapprove, there will be gossip, questions about propriety. Let them talk. Brian's voice was fierce with conviction. I've spent 7 years caring more about other people's opinions than my own happiness. Never again. Coco smiled through her tears, and Brian felt his world right itself on its axis. This was worth fighting for, worth any scandal, any complication, any challenge the world might throw at them. Daddy, Mama, Samuel's voice called from the French doors. Come see. The flowers are happy in water. They broke apart, both smiling at Samuel's innocent summons. Brian kept his arm around Coco's waist as they walked toward the house, and she didn't pull away. Ready for this? He asked quietly. With you? I'm ready for anything. Samuel met them at the door, bouncing with excitement as he led them to his room, where he'd arranged his bouquet in a water glass on his bedside table. The simple flowers looked beautiful in the afternoon light streaming through his window, a symbol of new beginnings and hope. Perfect, Coco pronounced, ruffling Samuel's hair. Absolutely perfect. Like our family, Samuel said with the profound simplicity only children possessed. Brian and Coco exchanged a look over his head, a look full of love and promise and the understanding that some things were worth any risk, any complication, any challenge the world might present. Because Samuel was right in the way children always were about the things that mattered most. They were perfect, as a family, together.